This is not a message for everyone. This is a transmission for the starseeds, for those of you who know or suspect that you are something different, something unusual, not of this place. These are the messages for you of the MaxAnte are bringing to you. Don't expect anything here to make a lot of sense. Everything is entirely paradoxical and is for you to interpret and for you to discern what is true. Vipassana meditation became the single biggest event in my life. It was the first death. I could say that my life was really split into 3 sections thus far. The first, growing up inside the matrix, being born, being grown for the purpose of being another little worker ant in the system to help propagate everything that's going on here. That was the first 20 years. But the second 20 years was going to be about shifting the allegiance. You see, we're always aligned to some kind of authority. It's just wondering or investigating which authority are we aligning ourselves to. I presume that most people don't even question, but I would say and assert, and maybe I'm even wrong about this, that everybody is actually aligned and vested in something. They're placing their trust in something, even if it is trust in nothing. That is still a place to trust, even having an authority of no authority. But mine, in the first 20 years, while being grown in the matrix, I had my authority as being society, of course. It was the human realm. It was me believing that everything was real that they said, 100% believing everything that they told me at school and at university, and that my parents said. I had no concept that things could be vastly different, let alone the realization that would come later, that everything was a lie. Every single thing that they'd all said, that nothing here was as it seemed, but that would take a long, long time. So it was that I just swallowed everything that they gave me. And then there was some doubts that began to creep in. By the time I was 19, and then by 20, I was questioning my atheistic views. I was, up until then, 100% certain that there was no God, that there was just the material world. And yet, I began to wonder for the first time, why did I even believe this? And how could I be so sure? I didn't really know anything beyond that. My allegiance perhaps must have been wavering just a little bit, but it was actually much stranger than that, because when I was 19 at university, I'd begun to meet these people, random people, who had told me about these 10-day meditation retreats that they had gone on, these silent Vipassana retreats. And every time they mentioned it, I was lit up. It's like I jumped up and said, tell me everything about this. It was like an activation, like I was pre-programmed to look for and hear this information about these remarkable 10-day Vipassana retreats. But each time I heard about it, it would sort of slip through my fingers. Until one day, I was at university, and one of my friends, she was glowing. She was completely radiant, sitting there in the courtyard. And I went right up to her and said, her name was Tony. I said, Tony, tell me, you look remarkable today. What's happened? You look so different. And she said, oh, I've just come back from one of those 10-day Vipassana retreats. I said, oh, stop. I've heard about this. Please, write it down right now. And so she wrote it down and gave me the phone number. And I ran to the phone booth because, of course, that's all we had in those days. Phone booths, no mobile phones. And I dialed the phone number without even thinking. It was like I was running on autopilot. And I dialed up And I said, send me everything you've got, and when can I do the next one? They told me there was a space in January, which was, I think, about 6 weeks away. They were already filling up, even back then in the early 90s. These courses that would become, over the decades, just jam-packed, booked out months and months ahead. Anyway, and so it was that without understanding anything about Buddhism, without having read any of the literature about what the Buddha taught or about Dharma, anything like that, I took myself on this walk. I caught the train and then walked up into the chilly mountaintop of Blackheath, hours out of Sydney. It was a cold day, misty, and felt so strange, heading to this very mysterious retreat. And I was such a talker. I loved to talk and to share and to discuss, and the thought of not speaking for 10 days and also only eating vegetarian food, all of these things were extraordinarily confronting. And to say I was scared would be to put it mildly. I was positively terrified, and yet I was still going. And I was asking myself every step of the way, why am I doing this? And so it was, I got myself into the meditation center, and it was very peculiar. Everything was so quiet, so still, and so cold. It was like an emptiness there that I'd never seen before or felt before. And we signed our lives away, committing no matter what happened, we'd stay there for the 10 days. Again, I had no idea what this meant. And so we began the retreat and took our oaths that we would follow all the rules perfectly. And step by step, each day, the meditation grew more and more intense. By the second and the third day, I was completely freaking out. Everything felt like as though the ground underneath me was collapsing. I couldn't understand who I was, what was going on. I had visions as I sat there in the meditation hall of the teacher beaming out these frequencies that were taking over my mind. And now in hindsight, I think that is actually quite likely. But back then, I just was falling apart inside this cocoon of metamorphosis. There was a transformation at work, but it was like I was sinking and desperate for just somebody to recognize me. My ego was just demanding, know me, see me, because nobody was. I was alone there with about 120 people. The room was divided between the men and the women, and our 2 meals a day, while we ate with everybody, was in complete silence. We didn't even look at each other. People were distant and removed, which was how we all had to be. But it was on the 4th day that I resolved, I just have to get out of here. And there was one guy who I kept an eye on the whole time. I didn't even speak to him, but somehow I felt like he was maybe a little bit like me. And I watched him and thought, well, if he could get through each day, maybe I could. It really felt like I was hanging in there by my fingertips on some edge into oblivion. And on that 4th day, while we were having a little rest, a little reprieve from the 12 or 14 hours of non-stop sitting meditation that we were gruelingly putting ourselves through, I was lying there and the storm raging outside, the thunder and the lightning. It was like a movie. It was so freaking intense. And then suddenly this massive clap of thunder hit the ground, shook the whole building, and this blood-curdling scream yelled out from the bathroom. I leapt up in my bed and just thought, oh my God, what the hell is going on? I really have to get out of here. And bursting through the room was that guy, the guy I'd been watching. And he went to his bed, grabbed all of his stuff, furiously packing his bag. The scream was still echoing in the room. The guy was clearly getting out of here. And I said to myself, well, I really have to go. But then the gong went. Gong. It was time again to return to the meditation hall. And we were now about to start practicing the real guts of the whole retreat. It was what they call Vipassana Day. So everything up until then was this simple, apparently, breathing technique that they taught us, this anapana meditation, where you breathed in and breathed out through your nostrils, keeping your attention fixed just on the upper lip below the nostrils. 3.5 days of that non-stop awareness on the upper lip of this breathing in and out. And I was exhausted, but I dragged myself because I was still such a goody two-shoes. I was so good at following all the rules in my life. I'd been a very good student throughout my life, followed all the rules at school and what my parents said, never questioning anybody. And so here I was once again, following all the rules, going along with what everybody said. And I found myself back in the meditation hall, being a good student, even though all I wanted to do was get out of there. And so they began the next session. And that was when they started to teach us Vipassana. And it was like if I thought the world was falling apart beforehand, now it was really on. This meditation of sweeping one's attention through the whole body, aware of each little cell, all the vibrations, all the sensations. My body was on fire. It was burning up. The agony was just blinding. I collapsed against the wall in what was about maybe a 1.5 or 2 hour session. They'd asked us not to even move an inch. Everybody else sitting in front of me through the whole hall sat like little Buddha statues, and I was perspiring and collapsing and freaking out as my body was being transformed into something that was entirely different. After that session, when I got out, it was like I'd run a marathon, like I'd climbed a mountain. And I went back to my room and just thought, how am I going to get through the next 6 days of this? The exhaustion was beyond belief, and we still had 3 or 4 more hours that very day to do. I don't know how I got through that next week. Probably it was purely because of this personality that I'd been grown up into of being an obedient, good citizen. That's what pretty much everybody is. That's how they can count on everybody doing everything, even when they don't want to. People follow the rules. That's how we're bred. And so I followed the rules, and I got through that first Vipassana retreat. And on the last day, when they allowed everybody to speak and share their experiences, that was when I experienced peace for the first time in my whole life. There was a stillness and a silence in my mind that I had never known. And on that 10th day, when I realized that the world had completely changed, that I was no longer that person, that now something new had emerged, I said to myself, if this is what peace feels like, I will go all the way. I will not let anything stop me. They said that this is what the Buddha had achieved, that he had taken everything as far as it could go, and that there was a place, a space in reality that they referred to as nirvana, that was completely free of all hindrances, free of all craving, free from all hustle and bustle and desire and anger and all of these human emotions that pulled at us and gave us so much agitation. They said that all of this could be completely liberated, that you could become something that was free at the very core. I had my first taste of it that day, and because it was such a radical experience, I knew that it was real. I knew that if this much transformation could happen just within 10 days, I knew that what the Buddha said must be true. And now I had the key, and this place I discovered, this was like the laboratory of transformation. And if I could just do what I'd done, then wow, what else could I do? Because they look like they've got a whole schedule of courses lined up for the rest of the year. And leaving the retreat, I was in a little car with some people who'd been doing this for even longer. This guy I was chained to had done it 4 times. Oh my fucking God. He'd done 4 of these 10-day retreats. I nearly died doing 1. I had no idea how he could get through 4 of them. This just sounded completely absurd. And there was his cute new girlfriend. I was just blown away being back in the world. Everything felt new. Everything was fresh. It was like I'd been born again. It was like that previous whole 20-year existence was snuffed out. And the conversation that I had leaving was even stranger, because they turned to me and asked me what I was doing. And I said I was at university, and they said, what did I want to be? This strange man who'd done 4 of these insane Vipassana retreats, asking me who I was. And I was trying to gather myself together. It was like I'd fallen apart, and there were just some pieces in front of me, and I vaguely remembered what I'd been into. And I think it was something like, I want to be an actor, because that had been my ambition from when I was 3 years old. From 3 until 20, all I'd wanted to do was be an actor, a movie star, a stage performer. And I'd done so much of that, and it had been my life. And I loved all of that. And when I told him, he said point blank to me, well, why on earth would you want to do something as selfishly egotistical as that? Why don't you do something that's actually going to make a difference for the world? Why don't you do something in science or health? Why don't you actually go and help some people instead of just becoming an ego maniac that's looking for applause? Boom! My mind just exploded. I had never heard anybody say anything remotely like this. And in that instant, all my ambitions shattered. It was like the completion of the death. Whom I was and everything I wanted just vanished. The 10 days had wiped me clean, and his conversation had put an end to everything that I thought I was and wanted. By the time I got back to my family that night, they could see something was different, because they only lived an hour from this meditation center in these beautiful blue mountains. They welcomed me in. Obviously, I had this very loving family with my grandmother and parents and everybody, and they were curious, very curious about what I'd just been through. I could see that they were a little worried that something might have happened. And sure enough, when they brought me the lamb chops to eat that night, and the glass of wine, I looked at them and said, I'm sorry, I can't have that. I hadn't even thought once about becoming a vegetarian or giving up alcohol. But in those 10 days, whatever this transformation had done, all of that fell away. All of my previous habits just extinguished. And I said, I'll just have the vegetables, thanks, and a glass of water. And from that day, I completely gave up meat and never had a drink of alcohol again. Even through all these decades, such was the transformation. I no longer had any interest in their habits, and I saw everything that they were sitting there as nothing more than a repetitive habit without any thought. Nobody was thinking or questioning what they were really eating, where it was coming from, what they were consuming. And now my mind was electrified with this radical new view of the world, that what we consumed had an impact on how we thought and felt. This was like a new world. I'd never encountered or even met people before who thought this way. And now it was actually not even outside of me, it was within me. I'd completely taken on board this radical new approach. And from that day, I started to live like that. Every day became a day of meditation. Every day became a day of yoga. Every day became a day of exploring a new way of cooking vegetarian food, exploring what it meant to be a vegan. All of this was a new world. And it was the early 90s. And I didn't even know anybody. I had to go and find people who were like this, who could relate to this new way of exploring the world, because hardly anybody did. There was almost nobody around. And I went looking and I found some friends. And I told them about what I'd done. And some of them were curious and interested. And they too went off to see what this magical 10-day retreat was going to be like for them. But for sure, my family was worried. And they'd realized I'd given up all of my previous ambitions. And I saw my grandmother crying and sad that the grandson that she had, she realized that he was gone.